Majority of the Filipinos support the government's efforts to defend and assert the country's maritime rights in the West Philippine Sea. Now, that's according to the latest Tugon ng Masa survey conducted by the Octa Research Group. An impressive 84% of adult Filipinos rally behind the government's efforts to protect our maritime rights, with the highest in agreement coming from NCR with 90%. The survey also reveals that an overwhelming majority, or 91% to be precise, of adult Filipinos are aware of the ongoing territorial disputes in the West Philippine Sea. Awareness is highest in the Visayas region with 96%. The survey was conducted through face-to-face interviews from November 10 to 16, 20 to 24, with 1,200 respondents aged 18 and above. Chinese maritime incursions in Philippine waters have intensified in the recent months. This month, the Chinese Coast Guard's so-called monster ship has been lurking off the coastline of Zambales for at least 11 days now. Both sides have issued radio challenges to each other, with National Security Council's Jonathan Malaya quoted as saying China was pushing the Philippines to the wall with this particular incident.
I looked at the calendar again, and actually that's 13 days now that the monster ship has been parked off the coastline of Zambales. Lots to talk about, certainly. Let's break it down a little bit further. Joining us this Friday night is our resident geopolitical and foreign affairs analyst, Richard Heydarian. Richard, where are you?
Kamusta na? I'm back in Manila. Good to have you back and good to be among you fantastic people.
Good to see your beautiful face again. I thought you were going to be here in the studio with us.
I was not aware. Sorry, I had.
Okay.
Ko lang, kaya pawis pa ako. Sorry. Mahabol lang.
Okay, so the survey, Octa survey on majority Filipinos, 8 in 10 Filipinos supporting the government's efforts to assert rights in the maritime domain is not surprising by any measure, but the fact that the China Coast Guard 5901, the so-called monster ship, is still there. This is something we were talking about off cam. Has been parked off the coast of Zambales for about 13 days now and counting, despite calls by Manila to, to move on. And despite the fact that both sides, Manila and Beijing, just had the 10th bilateral consultation mechanism this week. What do we make of all of this belligerence?
Well, the fact of the matter is that we're in a very sensitive transition period. We're just days away from a new administration taking over in the United States. We already had a couple of very entertaining, Senate confirmation hearings in the United States. It turns out that the incoming U.S. Defense Secretary is not very aware of ASEAN, but I'm sure he's aware of where the Philippines is in this part of the world. But from the statements we're hearing from top officials, whether it's Pete Hegseth for the Defense Secretary or it's Senator Marco Rubio for the Secretary of State, it looks like we're going to have a bunch of very China-focused folks taking over the top two positions when it comes to foreign defense policy of the second Trump administration. Let's just be honest, no one knows. Probably even Trump doesn't know what is he going to do. But the people are going to run his day-to-day foreign defense policy. Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, some of the folks we had even on our show, like Elbridge Colby, who will be the number 2 in terms of running policy in the Pentagon. All of these people are saying the U.S. has to focus on China. China is number 1 threat. And Marco Rubio also the other day was very clear. Senator Rubio was very clear that China should stop bullying part of U.S. allies and partners, whether it's Taiwan or U.S. treaty allies like the Philippines. And he has promised to double down on on America's assistance to key allies, frontline allies like the Philippines. So when we're looking at the transition towards a new administration in the United States, I think everyone is trying to put forward their strongest, essentially, version. In the case of China, by putting their monster ship there, something that they do quite regularly every year. They're trying to remind everyone of who has the preponderance of force, who's the superpower in this part of the world, and essentially also intimidate our fellow ASEAN countries into some sort of diffidence. I was just in Kuala Lumpur for an ASEAN conference earlier this month, and to be honest, barely anyone discussed the South China Sea disputes, barely anyone discussed ways to support the Philippines. The cliche that I kept on hearing, not only from Malaysian counterparts, but also from Thai and other regional counterparts, is we have to be neutral, we shouldn't choose between any of the superpowers. So when you have that situation, China wants to remind everyone who's the boss militarily in the South China Sea, so that ASEAN also doesn't do anything significant. But on the part of the Philippines, we're also signaling that we're not backing out, that no matter who's the American president, we're going to continue what we have started under the Marcos administration, or some would say much earlier under the Ramos and the Pinoy administration, which is to hold the line and to make sure that we're not just going to allow China to have its way. And we're also signaling to the Trump administration that this is not about us just relying on Biden. We are more than happy to work with any of our key allies to make sure that China will not get its way. So it's signaling both on the part of China and also part of the Philippines ahead of the Trump administration taking shape in the coming days.
Won't the aggressive stance of the upcoming administration also won't it drag us also into that conflict of two superpowers? We were talking about it. On one hand, we will get more support. It seems like it's going that way. But on the other hand, it might trigger more flashpoints in this arena. The West Philippine Sea might be a battleground for that. What do you make of, the level of aggressiveness of China? Are they preparing for the upcoming administration?
Well, if you look at the top Chinese strategists, including a couple of them, Tong, for instance, Professor Tong from Shanghai, they have been saying that we're ready for another Trump. We already saw the first version of Trump. The second version will probably be a variation on the theme. So go on, be our guest. And of course, China has every reason to be confident because, yes, despite the fact that they have demographic dividend, their economic growth is down to only 5% if we were to believe even their official numbers. The fact of the matter is that China's economy today is significantly larger than China's economy during the first Trump administration. And more importantly, China's military prowess and its technological prowess is significantly more advanced than when Trump was in charge of the United States. As you remember, over the past 3 or 4 years, China has conducted one of the most sophisticated and complex, massive multi-domain exercises around Taiwan. This was during the Biden administration in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan a few years ago. So this is a different version of China that Trump is going to deal with. So China is saying Trump is going to be Trump, but the China you're going to face is much more powerful. And to be fair, again, based on my own experience of dealing with fellow ASEAN countries, my own observation in Kuala Lumpur earlier this month, it looks like more and more countries in the region are also kind of seeing China as the inevitable hegemon or superpower in this part of the world. And they are also very doubtful about America's staying power, America's internal coherence, and also doubtful about whether Trump has what it takes to make America maintain its position as a predominant force in this part of the world. So clearly China is doing all of this, not from a position of dread, but from a position of confidence. And that's why it's important for the Philippines to also signal confidence and signal its investment in continuity of bilateral alliance cooperation as we deal with this marathon, which is the West Philippines disputes.
Rich, where Gretchen was coming from is that we were talking about this in previous days as well, because we carried the Marco Rubio sound bites from his confirmation hearing, and there's no other way to put it. His words were quite inflammatory, right? He said, for instance, and I quote, China lied and cheated its way to becoming a superpower. He said China was the most potent and dangerous adversary that the United States has ever faced. He is all for ramping up support for Taiwan, contrary to what Trump has suggested on the campaign trail. So I guess the question there would be, I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether or not that kind of rhetoric is going to worsen relations between the U.S. and China, and then in the process drag us along with it.
Well, I mean, to be fair to Senator Marco Rubio, he also made certain statements about, he wants to make sure that there are guardrails there, including in terms of intra-Korean relations. He doesn't want war in Korea, among others. But the fact of the matter is that since 2015, since the end, essentially, of the Obama administration, whether you look at Trump 1.0, whether you look at the Biden administration and now the incoming Trump administration, there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States. This is not just a Republican MAGA thing. This is also a Democratic, more or less position that China is the number one threat to America's global hegemony, primacy, leadership, whatever you want to call it. This is a position shared across the political spectrum, perhaps with the exception of the Bernie Sanders or the more progressive wing of the Democratic administration. So, in a sense, what Marco Rubio is saying is just a much more, I would say, spicy version of what we were already hearing under Democrats. So, for instance, under the Biden administration, if you listen to Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, whether it's Blinken, the Secretary of State, and most importantly, the Pentagon Chief outgoing Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, all of them also made it clear that China is the number one challenge to the United States global primacy and also to rules-based order in this part of the world. So I won't make too much out of it. And my sense is the Chinese are also not making too much out of it. They just see continuity of what already began almost a decade ago. So from 2015 onwards, we see increasing bipartisan consensus on the need for U.S. to confront China. And there's this sense also, of course, among MAGA folks, among Republican folks, that China cheated the liberal international order, that they use globalization, trade, investment, access to Western technology, not only to beat American and Western companies in all sorts of different sectors, EV, artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunication, but also in the military realm. If you look at hypersonic missile systems, some of the new fighter jets that China is developing, the reading in the United States, especially among Republicans, is that a lot of that was because of technological theft. And a lot of that was because of technological transfer from the West to China, and that China weaponized essentially globalization for its own benefit. My read on that is, yeah, I mean, this is what has been happening throughout history, right? The Germans did it to the French and the British, the Japanese did it to the West, and then later on, the story of modernization and rise and fall of superpowers is new rising powers copying, stealing from the previous declining powers. So I think what Marco Rubio is mentioning is not something unique to our historical moment. What is unique is that China is just the largest ever country that is non-Western that has come this far technologically and militarily in the last half a millennium. That is what I think is quite shocking and hard to absorb for a lot of Americans, especially Republicans and MAGA folks.
But Richard, did that surprise you? I mean, these strong words from Marco Rubio, because we were talking about this last night. Trump has been known to be very transactional, right? He did even say that if Taiwan wants the support of the U.S., then they would have to pay. But here you have Secretary of State nominee Marco Rubio pushing for a stronger stance against China and essentially putting Taiwan's security on the world stage.
Well, as I said, I think as far as Trump's mind is concerned, I don't even think he knows himself what he's going to do in the coming years. So there's no point in trying to make sense out of what is like the algorithm of Trump. But to the degree that we can say what is the algorithm of Trump, it's that he wants to open space for unorthodox solutions. Now, clearly, on one hand, if there's one thing consistent with Trump is that he wants allies to pitch in more. So Taiwan is already spending close to 3 or 4% of its gross domestic product on defense spending. Well, Trump is saying spend twice that. And when you spend twice that, buy American weapon systems so that we can make a lot of money out of that, right? So that's one thing consistent with Trump. He wants allies, whether in Europe or Asia, to pitch in more, especially wealthy allies and partners, whether it's first world countries, major military powers like Japan, NATO members in EU, or even partners like Taiwan, which is a very developed country and can have even more investment in its own military capabilities. But I think, of course, Donald Trump also has people like Elon Musk, who's very much invested in China, who has behind the scenes been talking to the Russians, Iranians, and the Chinese and doing his own parallel personal diplomacy. So there are also some tendencies within the MAGA movement and also within the Trump administration which want some art of the deal, grand bargain with China. But the fact of the matter is that, as I said, if the everyday defense and foreign policy of the United States is going to be run by Marco Rubio types, Elbridge Colby types, I don't think we're going to see a nice, let's be nice to China kind of America. At best, perhaps what we're going to see is the United States, which will put a lot of pressure on China, probably the same with Russia, probably the same with Iran, this revisionist powers or rival powers, and then push for some sort of a deal or a grand bargain. But in the meantime, the Philippines should not just be, standing idly by. We should also show to the Americans and to the Chinese that our faith as a country, as an independent country, will not be hostage to the whims or the whimsical tendencies of any superpower. And that when it comes to our alliance with the United States, we expect them to honor their side of the bargain, as they should expect us to hold the line. And if there's anything that I've noticed in my trips all around the world over the past 2 years or so, including meeting with heads of states, among others, is that they appreciate what the Philippines is doing. Maybe not in ASEAN, but in Europe, in the United States, among others, they appreciate what we're doing in the South China Sea. So we have to just continue what we do so that the Americans also realize that we are a reliable partner and we're an important semi-frontline state. The best way I can put it is that the Philippines is like Poland of Asia. I'm not talking about Poland in the 18th, 19th, or 20th century. I'm talking about Poland of today. Poland of today is a major U.S. ally and at the very front of helping Ukraine against Russia and keeping Russia as much as possible at bay. So the Philippines can play a similar role to Poland. Our economy is almost as big as Poland. Our population is bigger than Poland. We're not a superpower, but we can be a really reliable partner for the United States. So this is the message that we have to send, and these are the conversations that we have to have behind the scenes with the incoming Trump administration.
I want to get your thoughts on the upcoming ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas in that side of the world. It is said to happen on Sunday, January 19. The Israel's cabinet has yet to sign off on this deal. There are still Palestinians who are getting killed at this very moment before that. But what is your read? Both the Biden administration and President Trump are taking credit for this because they both have teams there. But do you think are they giving this win to Trump or to Biden? I mean, one day before he leaves office and one day before Trump gets inaugurated. I mean, do you think President Trump will inspire more respect given his unpredictability in world affairs?
Well, the Gaza issue is very important, right? Because again, if you go to Malaysia nowadays, you go across ASEAN, a lot of people talk about Gaza issue. And my sense is America's policy on the Gaza issue is something that that pro-China elements across the region are going to use against the United States, and that people are critical of the West. I mean, you had no less than Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, really openly accusing the West of hypocrisy when it comes to international law, upholding international law, when it comes to International Criminal Court, for instance, its warrant of arrest against Israeli leaders. Now, the fact of the matter is, technically, this ceasefire deal, if it holds, because there are many phases to it. There's exchange of prisoners. I think in Israel there's a law that if you're about to release certain prisoners, there's a 48-hour appeal period. So let's see if there will be agent saboteurs, what's going to happen. But assuming everything runs smoothly from Sunday onwards, yes, by next week we can look at a situation whereby Trump will be inaugurated, and finally we have a semblance of the beginning of a new chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think practically the consensus among all major pundits following what's happening in the Middle East nowadays and American foreign policy is that what was agreed to recently is not too different from what Biden had put on table 6, 7, 8 months ago. What has changed is that Trump is coming in. And we know that a few days ago, Trump sent a special envoy to meet the Israeli leadership, and that the special envoy of Donald Trump made it absolutely clear that Trump doesn't want this thing to continue. He wants some sort of stability. He knows, perhaps he realizes that the more this conflict continues in the Middle East, it's not going to be good for the United States. And of course, both Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio also emphasize that the U.S. has to reorient its foreign policy towards China. How can they do that if the United States is constantly bogged down in conflicts in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and what have you? So to be honest, I think most people would say the credit goes to the Trump administration even before Trump taking over, because if there's one thing Trump is good at, is that he knows how to remind everyone, especially allies, dependent allies, who is the superpower in the room. And the critique of the Biden administration was that they were essentially diffident, that they were not very capable in telling allies and partners or reminding them who's the superpower, who's providing the weapon systems, right? And who's essentially the strategic patron there. So even people are very critical of Trump are giving credit to him when it comes to this ceasefire deal, because it's honestly not too different from the one proposed 6, 7, 8 months ago. And yet now suddenly it's working because, well, of course, conditions have also changed, Israel's, military adventures over the past few months, but it's also because Trump is coming in.
Wow, I I had to pause there for a second. I didn't. Did I hear that right, Richard? You're giving Trump credit?
I know.
Let me. I need to
Absolutely,
I need to process that for a
fair
second.
man. Yeah, that's why I have many bashers, right?
You
'Cause I'm
are a
never
very
predictable.
egalitarian man, yes. But
Yeah.
Pete Hegseth.
This is my version of Trump. You know, I'll come from unpredictable angles. Right.
See, is that right? Is that right? But Pete Hegseth is still a bit of a wild card at this point. The fact that he does not know a single country in ASEAN. I mean, you talk about wanting to reorient U.S. foreign policy towards China, but how does that work if your Secretary of Defense doesn't even know, zilch about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the fact that, the Philippines is part of it and is a defense treaty ally to the United States?
Well, I'm not going to go into history of Fox News getting maps wrong in the Middle East, right? So for a Fox News anchor, although Princeton graduate guy, to not know ASEAN, it's not the shocking thing. I think it's really also fault of ASEAN. I think in many ways what happened there is a symptom of the state of mind in Washington, D.C., which is ASEAN is so ineffectual in the mind of a lot of Americans. ASEAN is so diffident that a lot of people, including Fox News anchors turned defense secretary soon, don't even bother to know what is ASEAN, right? But obviously, if you say Philippines, of course Pete Hegseth knows what's Philippines. Obviously, Pete Hegseth would know about our treaty alliance and would know about the South China Sea dispute. So I think that was less a question of ignorance about the Philippines or Southeast Asia than United States not caring at all about Southeast Asia. So siguro kasalanan din ng ASEAN. It's so I don't know, parang love na hindi na siniseryoso siguro
So
ng
there's not enough,
Eksino dyan.
we're not
Tama.
marketing
Yeah,
ourselves well
I'll
enough,
be
is what
honest.
you're
Like behind the
saying.
scenes in the West, most people don't take ASEAN seriously anymore. They used to.
Correct,
They
correct,
really
correct.
used to. Trump went to our ASEAN summit in 2017, but
Yeah.
increasingly they're not paying attention. Kasi napagod na rin sila.
Well,
Purong
there's hardly a
consensus-based
consensus
what
even
happens.
hardly a consensus even to this day on important issues like the South China Sea, right? So,
Yeah. So I would have been shocked if he didn't know about the Philippines or mutual defense treaty. I'm sure he knows about that, and I'm sure that his number two guys, the undersecretaries, more than enough know about this part of the world. The reason I say that is because I saw a lot of pro Duterte people online twisting that and saying, "See, Trump is gonna abandon Marcos because Hegseth doesn't even know where is the Philippines." I said, "No. It's definitely not along those lines." Yeah.